Hi everybody, and welcome to another edition of Staffing Insights, a series of conversations between staffing industry analysts and the World Employment Confederation. We talk about hot topics impacting the staffing industry. My name is Francesca Profeta, research analyst here at SIA, and today I am delighted to be joined by Pam Sands, Vice President DE&I Officer at Kelly and the WEC board member. So welcome, Pam.
Hello, good to be with you today, Francesca.
Lovely. So today we're going to be taking a look at diversity, equity, inclusion with a particular focus on the role of technology in helping D&I. But before we do that, let's have a quick review of the status of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the staffing industry. Things have changed and moved on. So how do you see the landscape progressing, Pam?
I think it's a very exciting time to be in the global diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging conversation. So some of the things that I see happening are the intersectionality of these conversations around the globe that are many times geographically specific. And so what I mean by that is, as I sit in the US but have global responsibility, you see that there's been a lot of movement for working with all different types of barrier removal in the United States. But as we look at other markets, you can see some very specific activities, like in Europe, looking at gender equality and gender pay initiatives. I see what we have in front of us, and especially sitting here and looking at new opportunities, is we have the opportunity to broaden the reach that we are looking at and the impact that we're looking to have by being very inclusive for things such as individuals that may present themselves for work with visible and non-visible disabilities, for example, age-related issues, those that are in the 18 to 24 range at one end of the spectrum and over 50 at the other end of the spectrum, as well as individuals that have been in military service in the countries where they live, LGBTQ communities, minorities, and looking at how are we not looking at it in silos, but very intersectional, because someone doesn't just present themselves many times in one particular way, right? And so I think that we have the opportunity, not only as employers and advocates in this space, to broaden that conversation and in many cases change the conversation, but also to really get behind advocacy and policy issues that support our ability to reflect the good work happening. So how we are able to capture information, how regulations support or defend that. And I think it's a broad range that we could take on and specifically look at the markets that we're in to do so.
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting point of view. And I think whenever I talk or think about intersectionality within the industry and within this certain time, its experience, I just see that we are moving more towards looking at the individual as a person, right? Like what makes up the person, what needs and requirements they have. I am a female, but I'm also a mother. I also have experiences via my parents and some issue, items that have arisen through that. So I really feel that people are really starting to acknowledge the individual rather than a group. And I always think that that's fantastic. I also feel, unfortunately, diversity advancements have been slow, not just for the staffing industry, but in the wider world of work. Unfortunately, when we look at attrition rates for D&I roles, there has been a bigger attrition of those roles. I think it was about 33% compared to non-D&I roles that sat at about 21%. And then we see things such as, female women in leaderships, they're leaving at a much higher rate than the men. So there's this kind of ongoing interlinking issues that have arisen there with technology, the advancements, but also burnout over the pandemic. So the pipeline wasn't fantastic to begin with. There wasn't leadership, wasn't overly represented, females weren't overly represented, but then we're having these bigger attritions as well. So I think where the issue arises is that our clients really are focused on achieving a diverse and more inclusive workforce. And as an industry, we kind of need to really rise to that challenge when we look at survey for Europe, 53% have a program for diverse suppliers in place, 39 are seriously exploring these in the next 2 years. And very similar when we talk about stats around strategy to encourage candidate diversity. But what is interesting, and that does really impact the temporary agency work, is over 50% of organisations have a programme or want to have a programme in place in the next 2 years to align their contingent workforce to the wider diversity goals. So although progress is slow, not just for the staff and industry, but for the wider world of work, I think that we do need to sit tight, realign expectations, understand that change is incremental, and maybe set some more achievable goals, and celebrate those smaller victories along the way, perhaps. So yeah, definitely not losing momentum, I don't feel. Future trends, Pam, are we seeing diversity, equity, inclusion move at all, or how do you see it progressing?
Yeah, I love that, and you just touched on that in some of your comments. I see from the conversations I'm in, and the conversations we're in together as well, is looking at a movement of how we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of a broader strategy, especially for companies that are signers of the UN Global Compact and that have strong ESG goals as an organization. And when you look at diversity, it's got a very natural fit within the S for social within ESG, but there's also components of it that can contribute to the environmental and the governance piece of what you look at. And if you take it a little bit more broadly and you look at how many of our initiatives support one or many of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's a way to really broaden this conversation strategically to say, how are we linking the good work between ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that it's really benefiting the whole ecosystem, where it's benefiting the overall world and planet that we live in, as well as the marketplace, the clients that we support, the suppliers that we work with, and most importantly, the individuals, the people that represent the talent that we put to work every day. And I think there's some time to really have some thoughtful conversation regarding that, depending on how each organization is approaching their own diversity, equity, and inclusion, social impact, and ESG strategies.
Yeah, like when you talk about the ESG strategies, I think that's where maybe we are going to see this develop into. I was speaking to a few people at our recent executive forum in London, and a few people I was speaking to are actually thinking that perhaps it's shifting to be a part of the ESG framework within an organization. There are issues, I think, around this. It's a massive undertaking, and sometimes the skill set required and the budget that is allocated don't always align. If you're proficient in the diversity sector, you might not be equally skilled in dealing with environmental aspects. So talking to clients there, they have said that they've actually been bolting on additional support, which is, I think, the correct thing to do. But also others have the thought process that it needs to have that intentionality, so it should sit there. It must have deliverables, it must be monitored, it must be funded like a proper business imperative with backing behind it. So I think we could speak about the business case of diversity, equity, inclusion, and obviously you mentioned belonging as well as the retention piece, but we don't actually have time for that on this particular thing. But it's worth mentioning that organizations who really do embrace this collaborative, diverse workforce, they just do outperform their peers all the time. So by having them run alongside a business case, I think that's sometimes where really diversity needs to sit with some intentionality around it. There's many issues around that, and obviously progress is slow, as I mentioned before, and there's other factors that hinder progress. And recently I've been looking at technology and how that can actually speed up the process. Maybe you'd like to talk about that a little bit before I kind of go into the report that I produced, Pam.
That would be great. And you mentioned So many things in your comments there, but I think one of those is taking that very human-centric approach, right? And looking at how we approach all of these topics, especially in our industry. That's really what we provide to our clients, if you think about it at the end of the day. So the same applies to looking at our AI strategies. So we've got to make sure, first of all, that we understand just the incredible advancements and opportunities that having a digital approach can do to support the work that we do. And it's absolutely there. As long as it is supported by a very human-centric way that we look at it. One of the ways that individuals can look at approaching this is work that was actually delivered by the World Employment Confederation last year, which is our Code of Ethical Principles in AI. It's something that I would say is a valuable read for anyone to look at that, especially the fact that it really underscores three important parts. One is which is, as you look at bringing AI strategies to how you work with people, is to make sure that you still have a good element of human control that is in that work, as well as some really good governing principles that you have in ethics and governance around the process, as well as a good amount of accountability in how we are looking at this. And some of the ways that I hear businesses leveraging this is that they also lean into many times their employee resource groups or affinity groups within an organization, those that have representation across the enterprise for all different types of individuals and the barriers that they may face to work, and leverage them as potential focus groups for how they look at bringing technology to their organization. It's really good for bringing individuals in the business into the strategies of the business. But it's also good for making sure that we're meeting the needs of the marketplace and who those employees represent, the voice that they have. And I think it's just really good, thoughtful work. I think it's definitely the time is here. And we also need to look at it with, like I've already said, a very human-centric approach.
Yeah, I think that we can't escape AI at the moment. It's literally hitting you on the head everywhere you go. And there's so much discussion around the use of technology and AI, obviously, in the diversity space to mitigate bias, for sourcing. Like most things, there's definitely pros and cons to everything. And, there's no exception with diversity, equity, and inclusion. In some cases, it could actually exacerbate existing biases. So you've got to be extremely careful how it's been used and so on. But, the lack of data and the lack of industry standards around diversity and the data around that has really been one of the biggest obstacles our clients are telling us at pushing efforts forward. They don't know what they're looking for, they don't know what to measure, they don't know if there's progress, and it's really hard to then have organizations say, yeah, we're moving, we're progressing, where they've got nothing to benchmark it on, they're not making any progress, they don't know. So I have been looking into this, and John and I recently published a DE&I technology report, and we look at the talent acquisition and technology products whose core function really does relate explicitly to diversity. And I was actually really pleasantly surprised at how many products are available to people. Some are perfect for mitigating the above issues of data collection, and of course talent shortages, sourcing candidates, or sourcing diverse candidates, may I say, and areas that really do lend themselves quite well to the diversity function do tend to fall within candidate discovery. So we've been looking at online job advertising, so job boards, social media sites, and so on. And there's so many examples of really specific niche, examples of higher tech ladies, job sites and includability sites. They're really very niche and very, very good. Talent platforms and staffing platforms. I've found one on freelancing for females, and so on and so forth. So sourcing automation, there's a company called Data People. They look at their job description software and the effect, efficacy around that and how communication is seen. So obviously the last part that we did look at was candidate engagement, which does lend itself really well to diversity and the advancement of that. And there you would find organizations such as Texaco, a recruitment marketing tool with bias performance indicators. So there's an array of research that is available and providers out there that can really assist. Another area which, you know, maybe we've been pushed into a little bit to look into, but you know, we have to provide evidence according to legislation and mandatory requirements, as you mentioned, Pam. Obviously, in the States, there's been some advancement in this recently. Did you want to touch upon that a little bit for us? And despite the 50 years of equal pay legislation, we're having to really enforce that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we see is you see the social movements, right, take place. You're going to see legislative bodies get behind that and then look at how they're going to change the regulations that are in place for the governance of that. You're always going to see that. And I think that's what we've seen. But I think that we're seeing this accelerated post-COVID, to be quite honest. And so I think that's why it's so important for each of us to be aware what these new legislative changes are, how we're staying involved with them, where we do business, not just where we may reside, but where we do business around the globe, and to fully understand that. And that's where having insights like from the SIA, the regulatory updates that we provide from the World Employment Confederation, help us really keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening there so that we make sure that we're advocating in the right areas for the people that we represent and the clients that we represent, so that we've got, you know, those fair regulations that support our industry. The other point that I'll make in addition to that, as we talk about AI, it's always funny, we talk about it from how it helps us, right? And that's how we refer to it. But there's also the piece that when you think about AI, it's that all of us are working with AI ourselves. So we're actually using AI, not just having it act as a function for how we are sourced and recruited and we do our work and we bring efficiency and effectiveness to what we do. But there's that piece that we are all involved with AI ourselves. And I think that's an interesting component to bring to the conversation and make sure that we're keeping the conversation broad enough to hear all of that thought leadership and perspective and the diversity of thought.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, we're talking about the US, but equally the EU Pay Transparency Directive will be rolled out shortly, you know, and we're going to need that kind of reporting and technology to help with pay transparency, salary history bands, certification, audits, assessments, and in the collective bargaining reign, which obviously the WEC sits nicely as well. So another area which organisations have really started to look into is not only pay transparency for gender, but there's been, and I know quite a few of our buyers in this space, more advanced in their programs, are starting to look at non-mandatory items such as ethnicity pay gaps and disability pay gaps as well. And that really does sit well within the ESG portion that we was, you know, we're going back again, we're sort of bringing everything in together, because we are very aware that organisations really must start to look at those things, not only to promote it to their clients or to their staff, but as a way of doing better, really. So that's a next stage perhaps that we would be looking into, and maybe an area which technology could lend itself once again.
I completely agree with you, and it is one that is definitely accelerating. And it also speaks to where we opened this conversation, talking about the intersectionality of diversity and the fact that we need to pay attention to what's happening in these markets. And we've in many cases, in order to look at exploring other reporting options, there are regulatory and advocacy things that need to happen in order for us to do that. So well said.
Yeah. So I think obviously we're having to draw to a close. Time is of the essence. We could talk about this forever. I know we both could. But I think that technology in this space has really brought some great advancements. And, you know, I encourage people to go out, look into the different areas to maybe facilitate some conversations there, talk to yourself, talk to anybody at SIA regarding this subject matter as well. But Pam, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you on this diversity, equity and inclusion piece. And I look forward to carrying on the conversation in the new year.
Same here, Francesca. Always a pleasure. Thank you for the work that you and SIA do to keep us all so well informed, and looking forward to continuing our conversation with us and others as we continue to explore these very hot topics.
Yeah, wishing you all a very good, great 2024. Thanks very much.
Thank you. You as well.